speaking to Walter Murch. Walter, great to see you again.
You too.
Okay, let's pick up where we left off.
I forget, where were we?
Last time we spoke, this cataclysmic thing had happened in the post-production world, and there were a lot of very unhappy people. And I'm sure you remember it well. In fact, of course you will. We spoke all about it.
I was one of the unhappy people.
Yeah, not just you. Myself and a lot of people that I knew.
Right.
However, we're now 4 years further in the future,
right.
and there's a lot that's happened. And my big question, just to begin with, is that very traumatic thing that happened in the post-production situation has now passed. Where do you feel we're at?
Well, I mean, you kind of, in retrospect, understand the issues that Apple was dealing with. The trauma was that Apple discontinued support of the Final Cut editing system that we collectively had been using for 8 or 10 years suddenly, and replaced it with Final Cut 10 or X, or however you want to describe it, which at that time was underpowered compared to where Final Cut 7 had been. Since then, I mean, we think roughly that a generation in software, if a human generation is 25 years, a software generation is maybe 3 years. So we are maybe 30 years further along in development. And, I have not used Final Cut 10 in any real world situation. I know people who are using it that way, and I just haven't. So I can't speak from an informed base about how I would feel if I were using it. In the intervening years, I did one last film in Final Cut 7, Particle Fever, which I worked on. It was a feature documentary about the Large Hadron Collider and the discovery of the Higgs boson. And so I was working on that in 2012 and 2013 using Final Cut 7. After that, I was the editor on Brad Bird's Tomorrowland, and I was using the Avid on that. And now I'm using Adobe's Premiere. So in the last 3 years, I've had experience of each of the systems. The one that I haven't had experience with is Final Cut 10.
I've been told, the editors I've spoken to in Hollywood, they say we don't know anyone that uses Final Cut 10. And it seems, I mean, I know it's being used because there's people in my area that use it, and I use it myself.
Right.
But it hasn't penetrated some of the markets. And what is this? Is it that it's just definitely not suitable for certain types of production, or is there a resistance because people are not happy with what went on before?
Well, like all of these things, it's very complicated. I remember as a kid growing up, when our expanded family would get together, all of the uncles and aunts and cousins and everything, inevitably, this is in the late 1940s, there would be a big discussion and almost would come to blows about Ford versus GM. How can you possibly drive a Ford? And then the other part of the family would say, but they're GM people. So, I mean, now in retrospect, it all seems kind of silly, and I think that we'll eventually get to that same place. But there are still partisan feelings about each of these systems. So that enters into it. There is certainly professionally in Hollywood, Avid is the dominant platform by far, simply because of capital investment and just the inertia of the system. And it's hard to change systems. I just did it, and I've done it like 3 times more. I mean, I started out on the Moviola, I switched to the Chem, and then I went to Avid, then I went to Final Cut, and back to Avid, and now I'm using Premiere. So each of those, you have to rejig your mind, and I think ultimately it's a great thing because it's like learning a foreign language. You expand your ways of looking at the world by the systems that you use. And that's one of the things that drew me to Premiere, was because I had used Apple Final Cut and I had used Avid, and I'm just curious. I'm that kind of person. I like to discover these new things and see what it offers. There is what I would call the ripped Band-Aid effect with Final Cut, which is we had our bandages ripped off violently in 2011. And so you're a little suspicious. Even if Final Cut 10 comes back to full functionality or exceeds full functionality, you're still suspicious of what happened back there, and can it happen again? And I'm finding with Adobe the opposite effect, and I'm experiencing with them something that I never experienced with Avid, and marginally with Apple, which is a full engagement with the filmmakers. I was Friday I was having breakfast with Joel Cohen in London, and he's using Premiere on Hail Caesar, the film that he just is completing now. He's in the last month or so of it. Very happy with it. We compared notes. Of course, there are little grumbles about couldn't they do this or couldn't they do that, but there is on the interface, there is the Joel Cohen arrow now, which is an idea that he had that he pitched to them, and within a couple of months it showed up. Same thing happened with me. I proposed an idea in March about trimming on the fly, dynamic trimming, which Avid has and Final Cut has, but in the beginning of 2015, Adobe did not have that. And I said, this is a real lack. You have to have it. And so they listened, and within 2 months, it showed up on the software. And so they are listening to filmmakers and implementing ideas, obviously not willy-nilly. There's a consideration of that at a deep level. But within a few months, those ideas can show up rather than waiting, whatever it might be, years sometimes, if ever, for some ideas to show up. So I'm experiencing that. I hope it continues. It's a unique experience so far.
To really make an editing system work, the editor must be able to fly with the system. You got to be able to almost not think about the technicalities of it. Now, not knowing Premiere Pro myself, because I use other systems, what do you have to say about that? Are you happy that you can think what you want to do and then just hammer it out on the keyboard and the technology is secondary?
Yeah, I mean, I'm working in London on a feature documentary about the CIA coup in Iran in 1953 that deposed the democratic government of Iran and installed the dictatorship of the Shah so that oil would continue to flow. I'm 3 months into it. We set up the editing rooms, and so I have a red L on my desk. In England, the red L is plastered on your car or your scooter if you're learning. So I'm reminding myself every morning when I come in, oh yeah, I'm still learning. But the slope has taken off. I reached that point that you're talking about where I feel I could think it and do it without trying to figure out where is that thing and can I do this. That started happening about 6 weeks in. There were teething problems with us, and part of that's just operator error or unfamiliarity with the system. Some of those problems I think are little bugs that still need to be worked out, but I would say 95% of those problems had to do with merged clips using sound recorded on separate media in multicam situations with frame rates being shifted from 25 to 24 using, blah, 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 blah. So it was material that the director had shot kind of willy-nilly in Iran and the United States and England over the last 3 years. So we were bringing together a bunch of very different ingredients, and there were some problems ingesting that. But once ingested, it now is, I'm feeling very comfortable with it.
Brilliant. Okay, now you mentioned that you're working on a documentary with Premiere Pro. If it was to be a feature film, would you be happy to cut a feature film on Premiere Pro?
Well, I mean, I actually considered for a few moments thinking about Tomorrowland. I thought, well, David Fincher used it on Gone Girl, and the Coen brothers are going to use it. This is back on their film. And then I thought, nope, I'm going to use Avid. And this was because it was an expensive film with lots of ILM-ery, as I call it. It was a packed cutting room. I think there were 13 people, visual effects editors, assistants, second assistants, all kinds of stuff. And everyone had to need to know the system that we were using. And at that time, in 2013, I think it would have been hard for me to put together a crew of 13 people, all of whom were at the top of their game and knew Premiere Pro. This film is just me, an assistant, and the director. The one I'm working on in London. So it's like I've still got the training wheels on, and it's not a juggernaut traveling down the highway. It's a independently financed documentary, and it's a good place for me to kind of cut my teeth on the program.
With full respect to Adobe, some people have actually said Premiere Pro is Final Cut 8.
Well, that's the nickname. That's what I would call it that. But I mean, that's considerable. That's something. It's 64-bit. Final Cut 7 was 32-bit, which was sort of the death knell of it. And I on Particle Fever, I kept running into that ceiling. You can't access anything more than, I forget what it is, 3-4 gigs, 2 gigs or something, depending on titling. Anyway, but it's there are many things in Premiere that in Final Cut I said, I wished it would do this. For instance, you can take a sequence in Premiere and put it in the source monitor and cut that sequence into another sequence. So you can round trip a sequence, which you can do in Avid, but you couldn't do in Final Cut. So continuity is valuable. Continuity with development is valuable. To constantly be completely reinventing the basis on which we edit. I'm glad it's happening. On a certain level, because things will be discovered. But on another level, let's say that we are pianists and we're performing, and to be constantly reinventing, no, it's not 88 keys now, it's 37, but if you press this pedal, then you'll, I just want to play the piano, on a certain level. So to have a reliable framework that is familiar within limits. I mean, I like to push envelopes. I'm the first person who mixed a film using a computer, and I welcome that up to a point. That's all. Okay,
so Premiere Pro as an editor, does it fill the needs of, like, is it what you need to work with, or is it still lacking? What are your thoughts there? Is there anything are there any gaping holes, or is it that you're actually happy with it?
Yeah, no, I'm happy with it. I would only condition that by saying I'm 3 months into what probably will be 9 months of a job. So I haven't taken it to those later stages, but no, I haven't found any limits at this point. Let's come back next year sometime, and I'll give you a fuller report.
And on another level, does it even matter what editing system you use? Because they all do the same thing. They all edit. It's like a car.
Yeah, I mean, that's the bottom line is that they will all do the job. Final Cut 7 is a zombie program, and there are certain things probably now it can't do because of the workflow has changed over the last 4 years. Final Cut 10, I can't speak because I haven't used it in a real world situation. Avid has its own limits. You can only use 25 soundtracks with Avid. For me, that's almost a deal. In fact, it is a kind of a deal breaker. I was troubled by that in Tomorrowland because I will regularly use 50 soundtracks or more. So, and that's clearly the way things are going. If you have to, if there are so many deliverables now that it's good to have all of those things present and not have to kind of say, where are we going to put this? And there doesn't seem to be a reason for that limitation. There must be a reason, otherwise they would have gotten rid of it. But I need that flexibility in the soundtracks. No, I haven't found any limits. And as I said, the powerful ingredient in all of this is the tight relationship between Adobe engineers and Adobe executives and marketing and the filmmakers, and that's all. There's a very quick turnaround there so far, and that's completely new to me, and I welcome that above everything, because if you have that, then you can solve whatever problems there are. They can be solved, and there are no gaping holes as you described it in this process.
It's a huge compliment to Adobe that you'd found it as good as it is, because I know a lot of people using Premiere Pro now, and they weren't necessarily using it before, and a lot of them take one look at Final Cut 10 and they say, no way. They just say, this is so different, and they really do not like what's in front of them. Mm-hmm. And I suppose some of it's familiarity. Do you have anything to say about that? The fact that it is so different, a bit like getting a car and they've taken away the steering wheel and given you a joystick or a touchpad.
Yeah, well, I mean, that's a good metaphor actually, in the sense that the automobile industry in 1912 had 3 or 4 completely different operating systems. There were steam cars, the Stanley Steamer. There were electric cars. There were gasoline-powered cars. But even in the gasoline-powered cars, a Ford had a completely different way of braking, for instance, than a Chrysler. I forget what it was, but it had something to you didn't have a brake exactly. There was some kind of clutch thing that acted as if it were a brake, and some had steering wheels, others had tillers. So exactly your analogy with joysticks and everything. So anyway, if you drove a Stanley Steamer, it would be hard for you to suddenly be driving an electric car or a gasoline-powered car. Today, you go to the airport and you rent a mid-size something, and you have no idea what you're going to get, what make of car you're going to get, but you get in it, and within 20 seconds, you know where everything is, and you take off, and you never think about it. So, that's if we're going to have the big 3, AAA, Apple, Avid, and Adobe. They're like the Ford, General Motors, and Chrysler. They're each different, and they have different modalities, But I think over time, necessarily, like the car industry, it will just become easier and easier to flip back and forth. That's something that I personally have experienced in the last 3 years, moving from Final Cut to Avid, now to Premiere.
And in the scheme of like editing history, I mean, when we did our very first interview, we spoke a lot about the history of editing and like who did the first cut and the first films that were made. And even last night in your presentation, you spoke about Birth of a Nation by Griffiths. Now, do you think, given that a lot of time will go by, you know, in 10 years, 15 years, even further beyond, when we look back at the history of editing, this upset that happened in 2011, 2012, as we've been speaking about, is that going to be like a little blip in the whole history of editing? And it's just one of those things that upset people, but it ultimately, the repercussions were not that big a deal.
Yeah, I think that's what we will look back on that. It was a big splash at the time. I mean, what I'm projecting into Apple's decision making, which is a dangerous game because of just how they are. But it's clear that the professional market compared to the consumer market is a small and demanding slice of the pie. Professionals need this and need that and need that, and if they don't get it, they get very angry because their income depends on it. Consumer level products, obviously people have opinions about things, but it's a much bigger market, and so there's much more what you might call slosh room. And I think Apple looked at what was happening and saw that Final Cut 7 was being used professionally, and that the shoes were beginning to pinch, so to speak. And they bailed. They got out of it, and they produced a product that was friendlier, let's say, to first-time users, because it was based on iMovie. And I think they saw not only the future, but almost the immediate future, which is you are not going to graduate from high school now without making a movie. Visual literacy is part of what we need to teach. You need to know how to write, you need how to do mathematics, and you need to make a film. Even if you don't become a filmmaker, you need to know what goes into making a film, because films will manipulate you through the media if you don't know what's happening with them. So I think it's going to become a major part of education in the 21st century. And Apple's Final Cut 10 is positioned very nicely to fill that need. It's just, and it's constructed in a way, I think, that it is friendly to third-party people coming in and doing plugins that will restore professional level stuff to it that was missing when the shift happened in 2011. So that's a model for it. So let's say in the future, the Final Cut 10 is in this position. It will get there because of the participation of third parties, not necessarily through anything that Apple is doing, because I think, frankly, they're just not interested in babysitting professionals. If you look at what they've done with their other professional software, that seems to be part of a pattern.